Story number 1. The roommate who hates the sun. When I first moved into the dorms at Eastern Ridge University, I was just happy to have my own space. Well, mostly my own space. Sharing a room with a stranger wasn't ideal, but it beat living at home with my overbearing parents. My roommate's name was Eric, and from the moment I stepped into our tiny room, it was clear he wasn't like most people. Eric wasn't there when I arrived, but his side of the room was immaculate, bed perfectly made, desk free of clutter, and a single suitcase sitting neatly at the foot of his bed. There wasn't a single photo, book, or personal item to hint at who he was. It was as if he hadn't really moved in, like he was just passing through. It wasn't until later that night, as I was unpacking, that Eric finally showed up. The door creaked open around midnight, and I looked up to see him standing in the doorway. He was tall and thin, his pale skin almost luminescent under the harsh dorm lighting. His dark hair was slicked back, and he wore a black jacket that seemed too heavy for the mild September weather. "Hey," I said, trying to sound friendly. "You must be Eric." He nodded, his dark eyes scanning me briefly before stepping inside. "Yeah," he said, his voice low and soft. "You're David, right?" "Yep, that's me. Just got in today." I hesitated, hoping to make conversation. "Where were you earlier?" He shrugged, tossing his jacket onto his bed. "Out." And that was it. No explanation, no small talk. He moved with a sort of quiet efficiency, setting up his side of the room without a word. When he was done, he sat on the edge of his bed, staring out the window as if lost in thought. The next morning, when I woke up, Eric was gone. His bed was perfectly made, and there was no sign he'd ever been there. It became a pattern. He was never around during the day. No matter when I left for class or came back, Eric's side of the room remained untouched. But every night, without fail, he'd show up, slipping into the room as quietly as a shadow. At first, I didn't think much of it. College is full of weird schedules, and maybe Eric just liked to keep to himself. But as the weeks went on, I started to notice strange things. For one, Eric never ate. I never saw him with food or drinks, not even a bottle of water. His mini fridge was completely empty, save for a single glass jar filled with a dark, viscous liquid. I never asked about it, but the sight of it made my stomach turn. He also never seemed to sleep. No matter how late I stayed up, Eric would sit on his bed, staring out the window or flipping through an old leather-bound notebook. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if he had all the time in the world. Then there was the smell. It wasn't strong, but it lingered, an earthy, metallic scent that reminded me of pennies and damp soil. It seemed to cling to Eric, following him wherever he went. The final straw came one night when I woke up to find Eric standing over my bed. His face was pale and expressionless, his dark eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "What are you doing?" I stammered, sitting up. Eric blinked, as if surprised to see me awake. "Nothing," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Go back to sleep." I didn't. Instead, I lay there, heart pounding, as Eric returned to his bed and resumed his silent vigil by the window. The next day, I decided to do some digging. Eric wasn't on the student directory. He didn't have a social media presence, no photos, no posts, nothing. It was as if he didn't exist. I asked around, hoping someone else might know him, but no one did. Even the RA seemed confused when I mentioned his name. "Eric," he repeated, frowning. "Are you sure that's your roommate's name? I thought you had the room to yourself." That night, I waited until Eric left before searching through his things. His suitcase was locked, and his desk drawers were empty. The only thing of interest was the leather notebook he always carried. It was old and worn, the pages filled with neat, precise handwriting in a language I didn't recognize. Symbols and diagrams filled the margins, some of them resembling ancient runes. One phrase stood out, written in English: "The blood sustains." I slammed the book shut, my hand shaking. Whatever Eric was, he wasn't normal. My mind raced with possibilities, none of them comforting. But the truth didn't hit me until later that night. I was sitting at my desk, trying to focus on an assignment, when I noticed Eric's reflection in the window. His face was pale as ever, but his eyes were glowing, a faint red light pulsing like embers in a dying fire. My breath caught in my throat as I realized something else. His reflection didn't match his movements. While Eric sat motionless on his bed, the reflection was grinning at me, its lips curling to reveal sharp, glistening teeth. I turned to look at him, but he was already gone. The window was open, the curtain fluttering in the cool night breeze. Panic set in as I locked the door and backed away, my mind racing. I didn't sleep that night, and by morning, I'd made up my mind. I packed my things and left. I didn't care about the lease or the deposit, I just wanted to get out. As I drove away from campus, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Eric standing in the parking lot, his dark eyes watching me with an unsettling calm. He raised a hand in a slow, deliberate wave, and for a moment, I thought I saw the faint outline of wings unfurling behind him. I never went back. I transferred to a new school, far from Eastern Ridge, and did my best to forget about Eric. But sometimes, late at night, I feel his presence, watching, waiting. And I know one thing for certain. You don't choose to leave someone like Eric. He lets you go. For now. Story number 2. Whispers in the dark. Moving into a new apartment with a stranger is always a gamble, but I didn't have much of a choice. Rent in the city was absurd, and the ad I found for a room was the only thing in my budget. The place wasn't great, small, a little run down, with creaky floors and flickering lights, but it was home, at least for the time being. My roommate, Sam, seemed normal enough at first. Quiet, polite, the kind of person who kept to himself. We exchanged pleasantries when we crossed paths in the kitchen or living room, but otherwise, we didn't talk much. He worked late shifts at a tech company, and I had a 9-to-5 job, so we rarely saw each other. It was a few weeks after I moved in that I started noticing the noises at night. At first, I thought Sam was talking in his sleep, soft murmurs that drifted through the thin walls of our bedrooms. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, a low, rhythmic sound that made it hard to fall asleep. I tried ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. One night, I pressed my ear against the wall. The words were indistinct, but it was clear Sam was having a conversation. I caught fragments of sentences, didn't mean to, and, not yet. Soon, his voice was steady, but there was something off about it, something that sent a chill down my spine. The next morning, I casually brought it up over breakfast. "Hey, Sam, do you talk in your sleep?" He froze, the spoon halfway to his mouth. "What makes you say that?" I shrugged, trying to keep it light. "I've just heard you talking at night. Didn't know if you were dreaming or—" "I don't know." Sam's expression darkened. "I don't talk in my sleep," he said flatly. Then he stood, dumped his cereal in the sink, and left the apartment without another word. That night, the murmuring started again, but this time it was louder, clearer. I crept out of bed, heart pounding, and stood outside Sam's door. The voices were unmistakable now, 2 distinct voices, one Sam's and one something else. The second voice was deeper, raspier, with a strange cadence that didn't sound human. I leaned closer, straining to make out the words. "Not ready yet," Sam was saying. "You promised me more time." The other voice responded, low and guttural. "Time is irrelevant. The door opens soon." My breath caught. The door? What door? The floor creaked beneath me, and the voices stopped abruptly. A moment later, the door swung open, and Sam stood there, his face pale and his eyes dark with anger, or maybe fear. "What are you doing?" he snapped. I heard," I stammered, struggling to come up with an excuse. "I thought I heard you call for help." Sam's expression softened, but only slightly. "I didn't," he said, his voice cold. "Go back to bed." I didn't sleep that night, the memory of that second voice looping in my mind. The next day, I decided to do some digging. Sam didn't have much in his room, he kept it meticulously clean, almost obsessively so. But tucked under his bed, I found a journal. I hesitated before opening it, but curiosity overpowered my guilt. The pages were filled with strange symbols and drawings, things that looked like they belonged in an ancient text. Scattered throughout were notes written in Sam's neat handwriting, the veil is thinning. Contact established. The door must not open. One entry, dated 2 weeks before I moved in, sent a shiver down my spine. I can hear them now. They whisper in the dark, promising things I don't want to know. But I'm trapped. If I stop, they'll find someone else. I put the journal back where I found it and avoided Sam for the rest of the day. That night, I locked my bedroom door and kept the light on, but it didn't help. The whispers came back, louder than ever, and now they were coming from my room. I sat frozen in bed, clutching the blankets as the voices filled the air around me. They weren't just in my head, they were here, in the room, circling me like predators. "Why are you here?" one of them hissed, its voice sharp and cruel. "You shouldn't have looked," another murmured, "closer now." My breath came in shallow gasps as the whispers grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of words I couldn't understand. And then, suddenly, silence. The quiet was worse than the noise. I felt a presence in the room, something heavy and oppressive. Slowly, I turned my head toward the corner, where the shadows seemed darker, deeper than they should have been. 2 faint pinpricks of light, eyes, stared back at me. I bolted out of the room, running straight to Sam's door and pounding on it. He opened it almost immediately, his face drawn and pale. "They're here," I gasped. The voices, they're in my room. Sam didn't seem surprised. He grabbed a bag from under his bed, slung it over his shoulder, and said, "We need to leave. Now." "What's going on?" I demanded as we hurried down the hall. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice tight. "I tried to stop them, but they're getting stronger. And now they've noticed you." "Who? What are they?" He didn't answer, just pulled me toward the front door. But before we could reach it, the lights flickered and went out. The air grew icy, and the whispers returned, surrounding us. "They won't let us leave," Sam whispered, his voice trembling. "It's too late." I don't know what happened next. The room seemed to collapse around us, the walls bending and twisting as the shadows closed in. The last thing I remember is Sam shouting something in that strange, guttural language from his journal, and then everything went black. I woke up alone in the apartment, the morning sun streaming through the windows. Sam was gone, his room completely empty, as if he'd never been there. The journal was missing, too, but the whispers remained. I moved out that day, but the voices followed me. They come at night, soft and insistent, speaking words I can't understand. And in the darkest corners of my room, I sometimes see those eyes, watching, waiting. I don't know what Sam unleashed, but I know this: once they find you, they never let go. Story number 3. The face in the closet. When you share a dorm room with someone, privacy is a luxury you don't expect. You learn to live with their quirks, their habits, the oddities that make them who they are. But with Mark, it wasn't the usual mess or noise that made him strange, it was the closet. From the day I moved in, Mark made one thing very clear: his closet was off limits. He'd said it casually, a tight smile on his face. "I keep some personal stuff in there," he'd explained. "Just don't open it, okay?" I didn't think much of it at first. Everyone has their boundaries, and I figured Mark was just a private person. But it wasn't long before the closet became a point of fascination and fear. Mark always kept it locked, the key on a chain around his neck. At night, he'd double-check the lock, testing it with a sharp tug before climbing into bed. Sometimes, I'd hear him whisper to himself, his voice too low to make out the words, his gaze flickering toward the closet as if it might burst open at any moment. It wasn't until the first night I saw the light that I started to question what Mark was hiding. It was around 2 a.m., and I'd woken up thirsty. As I reached for the water bottle on my desk, I noticed a faint glow emanating from the edges of Mark's closet door. It was a sickly green light, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. I blinked, thinking it must have been a trick of the moonlight, but there was no mistaking it. The light disappeared as quickly as it had come, and I told myself it was nothing, just my tired eyes playing tricks. But the next night, it happened again. And the night after that. Mark's behavior grew stranger, too. He was always pale, his eyes ringed with dark circles. He spoke less and less, and when he did, his voice was flat, almost mechanical. He started spending hours just sitting on his bed, staring at the closet with a look I could only describe as dread. "Mark," I said one evening, trying to sound casual. "What's in there?" He didn't look at me. "I told you. Personal stuff." "You don't even open it," I pressed. "Are you afraid of something?" His head snapped toward me, his eyes wide and bloodshot. "Don't," he hissed. "Don't open it. Ever." I didn't ask again. But the more he warned me, the more my curiosity grew. What could he possibly be hiding? Drugs? Stolen property? Something illegal? The questions churned in my mind, and the mystery began to consume me. One night, after Mark had left for the library, I decided to find out. The closet lock was sturdy, but nothing a little determination couldn't fix. I'd found a bobby pin on the floor earlier and spent 20 minutes fumbling with the mechanism. Finally, the lock clicked open and the door creaked ajar. The first thing that hit me was the smell, damp and earthy, like rotting leaves. Inside, the closet was bare except for a single mirror propped against the back wall. Its frame was ornate, carved with twisting vines and grotesque faces. The glass was dark, almost black, and seemed to ripple as I stared at it. I leaned closer, my reflection wavering in the dim light of the room. But as I reached out to touch the surface, the glass shifted, and a face stared back at me. It wasn't my face. It was Mark's. But it wasn't the Mark I knew. The face in the mirror was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a sinister grin. It moved independently of me, tilting its head and mouthing words I couldn't hear. My heart raced as I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the desk chair. "Hello," the reflection whispered, though its lips didn't move. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The voice was soft, barely audible, but it was unmistakably Mark's. "You shouldn't have opened the door," it said. The closet door slammed shut, nearly catching my fingers. I scrambled back, my heart hammering as the lock clicked into place on its own. The key around Mark's neck flashed in my mind. I had never taken it off him, so how had the door locked itself? Mark returned an hour later, his face immediately darkening when he saw my expression. "You looked, didn't you?" he asked, his voice trembling. I didn't answer. The guilt and fear were plastered all over my face. He sighed, slumping into his chair and burying his head in his hands. "I told you not to," he said, more to himself than to me. "Now it knows." What is it?" I stammered. Mark lifted his head, his eyes filled with a resignation that chilled me to the core. "It's me," he said. "The other me. The one I locked away." I didn't understand, and he didn't offer an explanation. All he told me was to pack my things and leave. "It's not safe anymore," he said. "Not for you." I left that night, moving in with a friend across campus. Mark never showed up to class again, and when I returned to the dorm a week later to collect the rest of my belongings, his side of the room was empty. The closet was gone, too, replaced by a smooth, featureless wall. I've tried to forget what I saw, but it's impossible. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I see the faint outline of that face in the reflection of my own mirror. It doesn't move, doesn't speak, but it watches. Always watching. I've stopped using mirrors. Story number 4. The Black Notebook. The first time I noticed the Black Notebook, I didn't think much of it. Everyone has their quirks, and a personal journal isn't exactly a red flag. My new roommate, Ryan, was quiet, tidy, and polite, almost too polite, if I'm being honest. He kept to himself, rarely spoke unless spoken to, and had this unnerving way of watching me, his dark eyes sharp and calculating. The notebook always sat on his desk, a plain black cover with no title or markings. He carried it with him everywhere, clutching it tightly like a lifeline. I assumed it was for school or work, but curiosity got the better of me one afternoon when Ryan was out. I wasn't snooping. Not really. I was just looking for my phone charger and happened to glance at his desk. The notebook was there, slightly ajar, and a single word caught my eye: David. My name. I froze. My hand hovered over the notebook, my mind racing. Was it a coincidence? A random note about something we discussed? Or was it about me? Against my better judgment, I flipped it open. What I found inside made my stomach twist. The pages were filled with notes, detailed, obsessive notes about me. My routines, my preferences, the things I said, the places I went. There were entries about the food I liked, the music I listened to, the times I came and went. He had written down things no one should have known, things I hadn't shared with anyone. But the worst part? There were notes about moments when I'd been alone. Times when I was sure no one had been watching. David went to the kitchen at 2:17 a.m. for a glass of water. He stood by the sink for 45 seconds, staring out the window. David checked his phone for texts at 10:43 p.m. He looked disappointed. David spent 12 minutes in the shower this morning, longer than usual. My hands trembled as I turned the pages. The writing was meticulous, the details unnervingly precise. The most recent entry sent a chill down my spine. David is reading this right now. I dropped the notebook, my heart pounding. The sound of the front door opening snapped me out of my daze. Ryan was back. I quickly shoved the notebook onto his desk and sat on my bed, trying to steady my breathing. "Hey," Ryan said, stepping into the room. His eyes flicked to his desk, then back to me. "Everything okay?" "Yeah," I lied, my voice shaky. "Just tired." Ryan nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Long day?" I mumbled something noncommittal and avoided eye contact. For the rest of the evening, I couldn't shake the feeling that he knew. His gaze lingered too long, his smile seemed too knowing. When he finally went to bed, I locked my door and tried to convince myself I was overreacting. The next morning, the notebook was gone. I wanted to believe he'd taken it with him, but something told me it was still there, hidden somewhere in the room. My paranoia grew with each passing day. I started noticing other strange things, my belongings slightly out of place, the faint scent of cologne in my closet, the feeling of being watched even when Ryan wasn't around. One night, I confronted him. "Ryan," I said, my voice trembling, "why do you have a notebook about me?" He didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he smiled, that same eerie, knowing smile. "Because I like to keep track of things," he said simply. "Things? Like what I do in the middle of the night. Like what I eat for breakfast." Ryan shrugged. "It's not a big deal. I've been following you for a while now, David. Long before we were roommates." The room spun. "What the hell are you talking about?" "You're interesting," he said, his tone matter of fact. "The way you move, the way you think, it's fascinating. I wanted to understand you." My fists clenched. "That's insane." Ryan laughed softly. "Maybe. But it doesn't change anything." I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed my things and left, breaking my lease and moving in with a friend across town. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I wanted to believe it was over, that Ryan would forget about me and move on to someone else. But the notebook wasn't done with me. A week after I moved out, I found it on my kitchen counter. The same black cover, the same meticulous handwriting. The first entry read, "David left me. I don't like that." My blood ran cold. I burned the notebook in my backyard that night, watching the pages curl and blacken in the flames. For a moment, I felt relief. But then, as the last ember died, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You can't burn me, David. I'll always be watching." I changed my number, moved again, and tried to rebuild my life. But every now and then, I'll find traces of Ryan, an email I didn't write in my outbox, a receipt for coffee I never bought, or, worst of all, a notebook sitting on my desk when I come home, its black cover unmarked and waiting. The first page always says the same thing: "I'm still here." Story number 5. The roommate's moonlit secret. Sharing a room with Kyle was supposed to be easy. He was the kind of guy who seemed normal enough, laid back, polite, and almost frustratingly quiet. If there was a perfect candidate for a roommate, it was him. But perfection always comes with a catch. The first time I noticed something strange about Kyle was during our second month living together. It was a full moon that night, and I woke up to the sound of the door creaking open. Groggy and disoriented, I saw his shadow slipping out of the room. The clock on my bedside table read 12:03 a.m. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he had a late-night job or a secret girlfriend he hadn't mentioned. But the same thing happened the next month, and the one after that. Every full moon, Kyle would leave at exactly midnight and return hours later, his clothes rumpled, his face pale, and sometimes, though I told myself I had to be imagining it, there were faint smears of red on his shirt or jeans. It wasn't until the fourth full moon that my curiosity finally got the better of me. That night, I stayed awake, pretending to sleep as Kyle gathered his things and slipped out the door. When I was sure he was gone, I threw on my jacket and followed him. The streets were quiet, bathed in an eerie silver light. Kyle walked with purpose, his hands stuffed in his pockets and his head low. I trailed him at a safe distance, my heart pounding harder with every step. He made his way out of our neighborhood and into the heart of the city, where the shadows seemed to stretch and ripple unnaturally under the glow of the moon. He stopped at an alleyway. My breath hitched as he glanced around, his movements quick and animalistic. Satisfied that he was alone, Kyle stepped into the shadows. I crept closer, peering around the corner just in time to see something impossible. Kyle wasn't there anymore. Instead, a monstrous figure stood in his place, a massive, hulking beast covered in dark fur. Its claws gleamed in the moonlight, and its eyes burned a feral gold. My stomach churned as the creature threw back its head and let out a low, guttural growl before bounding deeper into the city. For a moment, I stood frozen, unable to process what I'd just seen. But the sound of a distant scream snapped me out of it. I ran after the creature, my legs trembling beneath me. What was I doing? I had no plan, no weapon, nothing but the adrenaline pushing me forward. I found it in a park, crouched over something or someone. My blood turned to ice as I saw the lifeless body of a man sprawled beneath the beast, his throat torn open. The creature's head snapped toward me, its golden eyes locking onto mine. For a moment, I thought it was going to pounce. Instead, it bolted, disappearing into the trees with a speed that seemed unnatural even for something like it. I approached the body, my hands shaking as I reached for my phone to call the police. But before I could dial, a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. I spun around to find Kyle standing there, back in human form, his clothes tattered and his face smeared with blood. "You shouldn't have followed me," he said, his voice low and laced with something almost primal. What are you?" I stammered, backing away. Kyle sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't want you to find out like this," he muttered. "I try to keep it contained, to keep people safe. But sometimes," he trailed off, his gaze drifting to the body at our feet. "Safe?" I spat, my fear boiling into anger. "You call this safe? You killed someone." Kyle's eyes darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But instead, he took a step back, his shoulders slumping. "You don't understand," he said. "It's not a choice. The full moon, it takes over. I've tried everything, chains, isolation, sedatives. Nothing works." I didn't know what to say. The man I thought I knew was a monster, and I was trapped in his world now. "I can't live with this," I said finally. "I can't live with you." Kyle nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this. "I'll leave," he said. "But you have to promise me something." "What?" "Don't tell anyone," he said, his voice firm. "Not the cops, not your friends, no one. They won't understand, and they'll come after me. And if they corner me, more people will die." I didn't agree. I couldn't. But Kyle didn't wait for an answer. He disappeared into the night, leaving me alone with the body and a mess of questions I'd never be able to answer. The police ruled the death as an animal attack, and I moved out of the apartment a week later. I never saw Kyle again, but sometimes, on nights when the moon is full, I think about him. I wonder where he is, what he's doing, and whether he's managed to keep the beast at bay. And then I hear the news, another animal attack in some distant city, the details eerily familiar. And I wonder if Kyle is still out there, running from the monster he can't escape. Or maybe, just maybe, he stopped running altogether. Story number 6. The Mirror That Knew Too Much. I first noticed something was off with the mirror in our dorm room about a week after moving in. It was old, with a tarnished silver frame that looked out of place in the otherwise sterile, modern space. My roommate, Josh, said he'd picked it up at a thrift store, and he seemed oddly attached to it. He insisted it hang on the wall above his desk, facing both our beds. At first, it was just an inconvenience. The way the mirror caught the light in the evening made it hard to focus, and I didn't like how it always seemed to catch my reflection no matter where I was in the room. But then things started to get strange. One night, as I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone, I glanced at the mirror and froze. Josh was sitting at his desk, working on something, or at least that's what I thought. His reflection in the mirror showed him slouched in his chair, his head resting on the desk as if he were asleep. I blinked, but the image didn't change. When I looked directly at him, he was sitting upright, typing on his laptop. "Hey, Josh," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Are you feeling okay?" He turned to look at me, his expression blank. "Yeah, why?" I glanced back at the mirror. His reflection still showed him slumped over, completely still. "No reason," I muttered, lying back down and pulling the covers over my head. That was the beginning. Over the next few days, I couldn't stop watching the mirror. Every time I looked, it seemed to show something slightly off, Josh moving when he wasn't, objects on the desk that weren't really there, my own reflection staring back at me even when I turned away. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Then came the night the mirror didn't show Josh at all. We were both in the room, me lying on my bed, him sitting at his desk, but the mirror only reflected me. Where Josh should have been, there was nothing but an empty chair. My pulse quickened as I stared, trying to make sense of it. I glanced over at Josh, who was completely oblivious, headphones on as he worked on his laptop. "Josh," I said, louder this time. He pulled off his headphones and turned to me. "What?" "The mirror," I said, pointing. "You're not in it." He frowned, looking at the mirror. "What are you talking about?" "I can see myself just fine." I stared at the mirror, and sure enough, there he was, his reflection perfectly normal. My throat went dry. "Never mind," I said quickly. "Must have been a trick of the light." But it wasn't. And the mirror wasn't done with us. A few nights later, I woke up to a sound, a faint tapping, like someone gently knocking on glass. I sat up, heart pounding, and looked toward the mirror. My reflection was there, but it wasn't moving. I was frozen in the glass, sitting upright with a look of pure terror on my face. Then my reflection smiled. I screamed, jolting Josh awake. He scrambled out of bed, looking around wildly. "What's going on?" he asked, panic in his voice. "The mirror," I whispered, pointing. It moved." Josh turned to look at the mirror, but by then, it was back to normal. My reflection mirrored my every movement, wide-eyed and trembling. "You're losing it, man," Josh said, shaking his head. "Maybe you need to get some sleep." Sleep was impossible after that. I started avoiding the mirror altogether, but it didn't matter. The mirror wasn't just reflecting anymore, it was showing things. Things that hadn't happened yet. One evening, as I was getting ready to leave for class, I caught a glimpse of the mirror out of the corner of my eye. It showed Josh standing at the window, staring out into the darkness. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. When I turned to look at him, he was still sitting at his desk, completely unaware. That night, Josh did stand at the window, just like in the mirror. He told me he'd seen someone watching us from outside, but when we checked, no one was there. The predictions got worse. I saw flashes of myself, bloody and broken, lying on the floor. I saw Josh screaming, clawing at the walls as if trying to escape something I couldn't see. And then, one night, the mirror showed something I couldn't ignore. It was me, standing in front of the mirror with a hammer in my hand. My reflection smiled, its lips curling into a grotesque grin, and mouthed the words, "It's your turn now." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I waited until Josh was out of the room, grabbed the heaviest object I could find, and smashed the mirror. The glass shattered, splintering into 1,000 jagged shards. For a moment, I felt relief. But then I noticed something. The pieces on the floor still reflected my face. All of them. And each one was smiling. I moved out the next day, but the mirror, or whatever was in it, wasn't done with me. Every reflective surface I pass, mirrors, windows, even puddles, shows something just a little off. A flicker of movement, a shadow that doesn't belong, a smile that isn't mine. And sometimes, when I least expect it, I hear the faint sound of tapping, like someone gently knocking on glass, waiting for me to look. Story number 7. The roommate who never ate. Living with Ryan was supposed to be temporary. He was just a friend of a friend, someone I barely knew but who had a spare room in his apartment and was willing to split rent. The place was decent, cheap, quiet, and close to work. He kept to himself, which I appreciated, and everything seemed fine at first. But then I started noticing things. It wasn't the typical roommate annoyances, no loud music, no messes, no parties. No, what struck me about Ryan was how little he seemed to eat. At first, I thought I just wasn't paying attention. People eat at different times, right? But after a few weeks, I realized I had never seen him touch food. Not in the kitchen, not at the table, not even a granola bar or a cup of coffee in passing. His fridge was almost completely empty, too. A few bottles of water, a carton of milk that never seemed to go bad, and a box of baking soda were all that filled the shelves. The pantry wasn't any better, just a single, dusty can of soup shoved in the back. Curiosity eventually got the better of me. "Hey, Ryan," I asked one evening as we sat in the living room, me with a sandwich in hand, him with nothing as usual. "What do you usually eat?" He looked up from his book, his face calm and expressionless. "I'm not big on food," he said simply. "Never have been." That was it. No elaboration, no jokes. Just a short, curt answer that left me more uneasy than before. But I let it slide. Everyone has their quirks, and I wasn't about to start judging someone for their diet, or lack of one. The real trouble began when I noticed his late-night outings. It started with the sound of the door creaking open sometime after midnight. At first, I thought I was imagining things, half asleep and groggy. But then it happened again. And again. Every few nights, Ryan would leave the apartment, his footsteps barely audible as he slipped out into the darkness. I told myself it wasn't my business. Maybe he was an insomniac who liked to take walks, or maybe he had a night job I didn't know about. But the timing was too consistent, and his returns were unsettling. He always came back just before dawn, moving silently through the apartment. I never heard him eat or drink, but there was always a faint metallic smell that followed him, like rust and something else I couldn't place. It clung to him like a shadow, lingering in the air long after he disappeared into his room. I started piecing things together, or at least trying to. He never ate. He left at night. He came back smelling of blood. My mind went to dark places, crafting theories I didn't want to believe. But the unease gnawed at me, growing stronger with each passing day. One night, I decided to follow him. I waited until I heard the door click shut, then grabbed my jacket and slipped out after him. The streets were quiet, bathed in the pale glow of streetlights. Ryan moved with purpose, his steps quick but measured. I kept my distance, heart pounding as I trailed him through the neighborhood. He walked for nearly half an hour, heading toward an old industrial district on the edge of town. The buildings were crumbling, their windows shattered and walls covered in graffiti. Ryan slipped into one of them, a dilapidated warehouse with a rusted metal door hanging off its hinges. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But curiosity and fear pushed me forward. I crept inside, the air damp and heavy with the smell of mildew. The warehouse was dark, save for a faint glow emanating from a doorway at the far end. As I approached, I heard something, a low, wet sound, like flesh being torn. My stomach churned, and every step felt like a mistake. But I had to know. I had to see. The room at the end of the hallway was lit by a single, flickering bulb. In the center of the room was a large metal cage, its bars thick and rusted. Inside was something. It was too large to be human, its hunched form covered in slick, dark skin that glistened under the light. Its limbs were grotesquely long, ending in sharp, clawed fingers. Its face, or what passed for one, was a mess of jagged teeth and lidless eyes that glowed faintly in the dimness. Ryan stood outside the cage, holding a large hunk of raw meat in his hands. He tossed it into the cage, and the creature lunged, tearing into it with feral intensity. Blood sprayed across the floor, and I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. Ryan turned, and our eyes met. "Why are you here?" he asked, his voice calm but with an edge of something dangerous. I followed you," I stammered, my legs trembling beneath me. "What the hell is that thing?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You weren't supposed to see this." "What is it?" I demanded, my voice rising. "What are you doing?" "It's not a what," he said, his tone cold. "It's a who. Or at least, it used to be." The creature growled, its eyes darting toward me. I stumbled back, my mind racing. "What do you mean, used to be?" Ryan didn't answer. Instead, he stepped toward me, his expression unreadable. "You need to leave," he said. "Now." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. "Why, Ryan? What is this thing? What are you?" He didn't reply. He just stared at me, his eyes dark and unblinking. And then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You don't want to know." I left that night, my heart racing as I stumbled back to the apartment. I packed my things and moved out the next day, leaving no forwarding address. I never saw Ryan again, but I still think about him and the thing in the cage. Sometimes, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. Sometimes, I wonder if Ryan was telling the truth when he said it used to be someone. And sometimes, late at night, I catch a faint, metallic smell in the air and wonder if he's found someone new to share his secret with. Story number 8. The roommate who stole time. When Brandon moved in, I didn't think much of it. He seemed normal, quiet, polite, and surprisingly neat for a college student. Compared to my last roommate, who never washed a dish and played bass guitar at 2 a.m., Brandon was a dream. But looking back, I should have known something was wrong. The signs were there from the start. The first time I noticed it, I had just finished a morning class and decided to stop by the coffee shop near campus. I distinctly remembered placing my order, a black coffee and a blueberry muffin, and then nothing. The next thing I knew, I was standing in our dorm room, the uneaten muffin in my hand and my coffee lukewarm. It was like I'd blinked and teleported across campus. "Long day?" Brandon asked, glancing up from his laptop. His tone was casual, but there was something about the way he watched me that made my skin crawl. "Yeah," I mumbled, brushing it off. "Just tired." But it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, it happened again and again. Hours would disappear without warning. I'd head to class and find myself sitting in the library, unsure how I got there. I'd go to the gym and end up back in the dorm, still in my workout clothes, but with no memory of actually working out. At first, I thought it was stress. College is demanding, and my sleep schedule wasn't exactly healthy. But the more it happened, the more I realized this wasn't normal. Something was wrong. The worst part was the dreams, or rather, the lack of them. I've always been a vivid dreamer, my nights filled with strange, colorful stories that I could sometimes even remember the next day. But since Brandon moved in, my nights were blank. It was as if I wasn't sleeping at all, just disappearing into the void. One night, I woke up to find Brandon standing over me. I jolted upright, my heart pounding. "What the hell are you doing?" He didn't flinch, his face eerily calm. "You were talking in your sleep," he said, his voice smooth and even. "I was just making sure you were okay." I didn't believe him, but I was too shaken to argue. He left the room without another word, and I spent the rest of the night lying awake, staring at the ceiling and trying to convince myself I wasn't losing my mind. The next day, I decided to investigate. Brandon wasn't in the dorm, he had a habit of disappearing for hours at a time, so I took the opportunity to search his side of the room. His desk was meticulously organized, with a neat stack of textbooks and a laptop that required a password. I was about to give up when I noticed a small leather-bound journal tucked under his pillow. I hesitated. Snooping wasn't exactly ethical, but at this point, I needed answers. I pulled the journal out and flipped it open. The pages were filled with strange symbols and diagrams, things that looked like they belonged in an ancient manuscript rather than a college dorm. There were notes written in Brandon's precise handwriting, detailing something he called the extraction ritual. My stomach turned as I read the descriptions. The subject's memories are stored in the subconscious. By tapping into the energy of the soul, these memories can be extracted and consumed. The process must be repeated nightly to maintain potency. My hands trembled as I flipped through the pages. Each entry was dated, and the most recent one sent a chill down my spine. Subject, David. Memory extraction successful. Total duration, 4 hours. I dropped the journal as if it had burned me. My mind raced, piecing together the fragments of lost time and blank dreams. Brandon wasn't just my roommate, he was stealing my memories, feeding on them like some kind of parasite. That night, I didn't sleep. I pretended to, lying in bed with my eyes closed, my heart hammering in my chest as I waited. Sure enough, just after midnight, I heard Brandon moving. The soft creak of his bed, the faint rustle of his footsteps. He stopped beside me, and I felt his presence like a weight in the room. "David," he murmured, his voice low and almost tender. "You have no idea how much you've given me." I opened my eyes. Brandon froze, his hand outstretched, glowing faintly with a strange, ethereal light. His expression shifted from surprise to anger in an instant. "You weren't supposed to wake up," he said, his voice cold and sharp. "What the hell are you doing to me?" I demanded, scrambling out of bed. Brandon didn't answer. Instead, he raised his hand, and the light flared brighter. A wave of dizziness crashed over me, and I stumbled, my vision blurring. "It's not personal," he said, his tone almost apologetic. "You were just convenient." I didn't wait to hear the rest. With every ounce of strength I had, I lunged at him, knocking the journal off his desk and sending it skidding across the floor. Brandon yelled, trying to grab me, but I was already out the door, clutching the journal like a lifeline. I spent the next few days sleeping in my car, too afraid to go back to the dorm. I read the journal cover to cover, learning more about the ritual and the things Brandon had done to me, and, apparently, to others before me. He'd been doing this for years, hopping from place to place, draining people of their memories until there was nothing left. I reported him to campus security, but by the time they searched the dorm, he was gone. No trace of him remained, not even his laptop or clothes. It was as if he'd never been there at all. I transferred schools the following semester, but the damage had already been done. My memories are patchy, like a jigsaw puzzle with missing pieces. I can't remember entire weeks of my life, and sometimes I'll wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that someone is standing over me, watching. Brandon is still out there. I don't know where or who he's targeting now. But I do know one thing: if you ever meet someone who seems too perfect, who knows too much about you, who never seems to sleep, run. Don't look back. Because once Brandon chooses you, he won't stop until he's taken everything. Story number 9. The Ageless Roommate. The first thing I noticed about Mark was his unremarkable presence. He was friendly enough, kept to himself, and had this quiet charm that made him easy to get along with. But looking back, I think that was the point. He didn't want anyone to look too closely. I moved into the dorm halfway through the semester, desperate for a change after my old roommate dropped out and left me with a silent, empty space. Mark was already there, settled in with a few books on the shelves and a battered guitar propped against the wall. He smiled when I introduced myself, shaking my hand with an odd familiarity, like he already knew me. "It's nice to have company," he said. "It gets lonely here sometimes." At first, I thought he was just being polite. But over time, I began to notice how little Mark's life seemed to change. While I was drowning in coursework, juggling projects and late-night study sessions, he always seemed relaxed, like he had all the time in the world. He never stressed about exams, never complained about deadlines, and never mentioned any friends or family. He'd just sit in the room, reading or strumming his guitar, his demeanor calm and detached. Then there was his appearance. Mark had this timeless look, clean-shaven, neatly dressed, with sharp features and bright eyes that didn't match his age. He said he was a senior, But there was something about him that didn't add up. He looked exactly the same in every photo he showed me, even the ones he claimed were from years ago. The first time I heard the rumor, I laughed it off. I was in the common room, and a couple of juniors were whispering about Mark. "You know he's been here forever, right?" one of them said. "Like, since before my dad went to this school." "That's just an urban legend," the other replied, rolling her eyes. "People say the same thing about half the professors." But the idea stuck with me. That night, as I lay in bed, I glanced over at Mark, who was sitting at his desk, reading as usual. The thought wormed its way into my brain: what if it's true? What if he really has been here forever? The next day, I started digging. The campus archives were surprisingly well organized, filled with old yearbooks and photographs from decades past. It didn't take long to find him. There he was, in a black and white photo from 1972, standing in front of the same dorm building we lived in. His hair was longer, and his clothes were vintage, but it was unmistakably Mark. My stomach churned as I flipped through the years, finding him again and again: 1984, 1997, 2009. Always the same face, the same ageless features. When I confronted him, he didn't even try to deny it. "I was wondering when you'd figure it out," he said, leaning back in his chair with a small smile. "Most people don't bother." "What are you?" I demanded, my voice shaking. "Some kind of immortal? A ghost?" "Not exactly," he replied, his tone calm, almost bored. "I'm stuck, I guess you could say. Bound to this place." "Why?" I asked. "How?" He hesitated, his gaze distant. "It's complicated. Let's just say there's a price for everything, and I paid mine a long time ago." He wouldn't tell me more, no matter how much I pressed. But after that conversation, I started noticing things I hadn't before. The way Mark avoided certain places on campus, like the chapel or the library basement. The way his reflection in the mirror seemed slightly off, like it wasn't quite in sync with his movements. And the way he seemed to know things he shouldn't, like what I was going to say before I said it, or where I'd left something without ever seeing me put it there. The more time I spent around him, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just the mystery of his existence, it was the way he seemed to watch me, like he was waiting for something. One night, I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was a dream, but then I saw Mark standing by my bed, his lips moving soundlessly. His eyes were closed, his face pale and strained. I tried to call out to him, but my voice caught in my throat. The air felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me, holding me in place. When I finally managed to sit up, Mark jerked away, his eyes wide with alarm. "You weren't supposed to wake up," he muttered, retreating to his desk. "What were you doing?" I demanded, my voice hoarse. He didn't answer. He just sat there, his back to me, the shadows in the room seeming to gather around him like a shroud. The next day, I found a note on my desk. It was written in Mark's neat handwriting, but the words sent a chill down my spine. "Leave before it's too late." I didn't need to be told twice. I packed my things and requested a room transfer that same day. The housing office was surprisingly accommodating, and within a week, I was gone. I never saw Mark again, but the stories followed me. Whispers about a man who had been at the school longer than anyone could remember, who always seemed to have a new roommate but never kept them for long. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed. Would I have become like him, bound to that dorm, my life frozen in place? Or would I have simply disappeared, leaving no trace behind? I don't know. And I don't want to. But I'll never forget Mark's parting words, spoken as I walked out the door for the last time. "Everyone thinks they want to live forever," he said, his voice low and tired. "Until they find out what it costs."